get rid of her screen.
Yep.
I'll go to class.
Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's presentation, this latest in a series of wonderful presentations we've been seeing about some of the wonderful things that members of our class are doing and have been doing. I'm Ken Wilcox. I'm your ink-stained class scribe, and I'm going to be your host this evening. And I think you're going to see a very compelling story this evening. You're going to hear Rich Gehrman's work for children, and that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it, I think you'll see, is the phenomenon of someone who has had a career path, recognized a crisis in the community, and turned his career upside down and went all in, started an organization to address the problem. So I think it's unique and pretty riveting. Before I get into the guts of this, I do have a personal message. I'd just like to thank all of you who have been so consistent in sending in news for class news for my class notes. You've kept me going here for a little while, and you also precluded me from having to make things up about you. So thank you very much for that. And as a heads up, I have another deadline coming up here pretty soon, so you'll probably hear from me in a week or so. Okay, so on to hardware issues. This meeting is being recorded. And just as a reminder, this is part of this, the college's bicentennial of the Society of Alumni. There's a series of events going on all year to commemorate the Society of Alumni that we all are members of and share the love of liberal arts education and the college we had such a great experience with. So stay tuned for that. You'll be getting regular updates on those events. And another reminder, we got a reunion coming up next year, so put it on your calendar. Who knows what the virus is going to do to us, but hopefully it'll be past tense by then and we can reconvene as we always have. So sequence of events this evening, Rich Gehrman is going to make his presentation, and that'll go until about 7:40. Then we'll have a breakout room for an opportunity to talk among ourselves about what we've just heard and really anything else. We'll come back at 8 o'clock, and that'll be your opportunity to ask Rich any questions you may have. Before we get into the questions, we're going to have another Zoom photo, so smile pretty and be sure you don't have a mask on. And then the formal presentation tonight will end at 8:15, but we'll probably hang on for another 15 minutes after that if anybody has anything else to add. So with that, let me give you a brief introduction about Rich and what he's been after these years. Rich is founder and executive director of the Safe Passages for Children. It's a child welfare advocacy organization. Safe Passage trains volunteers to advocate with their elected officials for more resources, child-focused casework practices, and improved accountability and transparency in child protection and foster care. It's become the model for child welfare in the nonprofit world. And by the way, his efforts have been supported by a number of our classmates. Prior to starting Safe Passages, Rich was a project management consultant in healthcare and human services and a senior manager in state, county, and municipal governments. Those included the state of Maryland, as well as Westchester County and the city of St. Paul. He began his career in Boston working with runaways and street youth and as a community organizer and energizer. Rich is a graduate of Williams, of course, but also the Harvard Divinity School and the Harvard Business School. I was able to connect with Rich when he came to the Twin Cities to work for a company that was developing some IT software for welfare assistance. He morphed soon after that, or sometime after that, into becoming the finance director for the city of St. Paul, and did a great job with that. So with that, I will turn the mic over to Rich and his presentation, and enjoy.
Well, thanks, Ken. Now, I'm going to share my screen here, and it may take a minute for all of these transitions to occur, so please bear with me, and I'll try to get this up and running as quickly as possible. Okay, so hopefully all you can see is our mission statement there, and I've got some things on my screen. I just want to say it's great to see everybody, and thank you all for coming to this. I'm going to tell you about Safe Passage and hopefully leave enough time for us all to chat some. Safe Passage, as our logo here says, is its mission is to strengthen the Minnesota child welfare system so children are safe and reach their full potential. And so how that plays out is that the key elements here are we're a citizens group, so we engage citizens in advocating for systemic improvements, which basically means that we don't do direct service, and we're focused on kind of reform type things. I love this photo of these kids because, they're not the usual playground smiling, happy kids. This is a group that's obviously together because they have some issues, but they're still pretty lovable. So let me just give you the basics of child welfare because not everybody's had, a lot of opportunity to be aware of this program. It's a public program, first of all, run by states or counties, so you wouldn't have it run by a nonprofit. Most states run it themselves. Minnesota is one of 10 where the counties run it, which has a lot of issues because there's 2 tribes and 87 counties, and so there's 89 different ways of doing business. It breaks down into 2 major parts. Child protection is the first part, and its job is to respond to reports of maltreatment. So we'll be thinking about this woman answering this phone call throughout because what she's doing is taking a call from someone who is saying that they're concerned about children being abused or neglected. Now, abuse and neglect are the 2 categories of maltreatment. You might naturally assume that neglect is less serious, but actually it's often, if not usually, more serious because of the lifelong debilitating effects of severe neglect, particularly during the early developmental years. And then if things do not work, the second major part of child welfare is out-of-home care, usually foster care or kinship foster care. So those are the major parts. And if this woman decides that the call is serious and needs to be screened into child protection, the next step is to go to one of 2 paths in child protection. Up until the early 2000s, all there was traditional investigation. And that involves things like legal determination of whether or not maltreatment occurred. You can go to court, you can have a custody trial and lose your children. You have mandatory services, either in home or if not, while the kids are in foster care to try to get your kids back home. The alternative response came around in the early 2000s. It was an attempt to develop a kinder, gentler version of child welfare. The idea was that you should try to engage families rather than force them to work with you, and that children would be safer. In fact, what has happened is that really wasn't empirically based, and people refused services, but then they weren't required to be in child protection. So the response rate is actually quite a bit lower. And children are not as safe because the re-report of child maltreatment and other metrics show that more children come back into the system in the alternative fact. So we're concerned because some of the practices that are standard in this are that you just offer services. Workers will come out and say, we're not here to ask a lot of questions. We're just here to see if we can offer some services. There's no determination of whether abuse or neglect occurred, which is good in the sense it doesn't go on people's record and perhaps affect employment. But you also don't really have a decision about what happened. There's no fact-finding protocol that people are required to follow. In fact, they're discouraged from doing fact-finding. There's an advance notice of the child protection visit, which means families often get, the adults in the families often get 4 or 5 days to get ready for that child protection visit, and and often take out the ice packs and get the bruises down. And mostly the concern is they coach children on what to say. You better not say such and such or else kind of thing. And then when the worker gets there, they do what is called a whole family interview, which means they interview the children in front of all the adults in the household. So our concern is this increases the danger to the child. They're obviously not going to, I think it's obvious, they're not going to open up and share what's going on. You're not going to get the facts you need to know to see if the children are safe. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time because I want to save time for stories. Those are our goals, and I think they'll come out in the presentation. So I have been, usually I think maybe at our stage, we don't talk a lot about our childhood. I really don't often talk about my own, but my handlers have persuaded me that to answer the question about why I'm doing this, that some of my personal background is pertinent. So I grew up in the projects in Cleveland, public assistance, generally known as the projects. This is a typical one, usually in a part of the city where the highest and best use of the property is to do industrial stuff or to do housing projects. It's a typical view of what it looks like in that setting. Maybe something like, I wouldn't be surprised if Tom Phillips knocked down a few of these and when he was doing his, renovating that part of the city. It's just not, it's not like being homeless, but it's a little bit dreary. And one of my earliest memories is the first day we moved in, I walked up to the front door of the building and the first thing that went through my mind is, I am going to get out of here one way or the other, and so I was pretty driven as a kid in school to get through some of this stuff and get out. And there were a lot of advantages in terms of things that I kind of understand at a gut level and can feel my way through, just like any of us in our own, kind of worlds that we grew up in that aren't obvious to others. And it makes my political point of views somewhat eclectic compared to many of my friends. So there we were, and never knew if I was going to get out. But my first big break was my older brother came home from the Army and checked in with some of his old buddies and realized they had turned pro while he was gone from some of the mischief that they were causing when he was a kid. So he and my mother kind of pooled their resources and we moved out. Not that far away, but my second big break was to a district that had a really good public high school. And I had a guidance counselor who took an interest in me and said, you maybe can set your sights higher than one of the state schools, took up a collection and bought me a bus ticket to Williamstown. And that was something else. I mean, after an all-night bus trip and a couple of transfers, I get to Williamstown. It's like this January, it's really cold. And I get off this little bus and I was transfixed. I'd never seen architecture like that, never seen these beautiful buildings, the mountains. I mean, it took me a while to kind of gather myself, collect myself and start to figure out where I had to go. So that was a tremendous experience. And, I think that changed the trajectory of my life, of course, as well as my kids and grandkids. And it's something that, being accepted at Williams is something that I'm always mindful of and always grateful for. So that, I hope, kind of explains why, in general, I'm interested in issues of poverty and I've always been interested in issues about justice. But it doesn't necessarily explain why this particular field of child welfare. And I think, generally speaking, so many Williams people are doing so many great things in the civic community. There are lots of ways that I could have kind of used the skills I acquired and gone back that would have been really worthy and honorable. But what happened is after Williams, I went to Harvard Divinity School, as Ken mentioned, and I had a field placement working with runaways and street kids. It was the first shelter for these kids, east of San Francisco in the early days when the flower children were around. And these kids were nowhere to be seen up until about that year. And then there were thousands of them. There were thousands of these kids sleeping on the Boston Commons every night. Nobody knew where they came from. And I quickly learned, that their lives were full of fear. Many of them were 12 to 16 years old, and they were prostituting themselves just to stay alive. And in the early days of this shelter that we ran, it was just basically a place for the street scene to happen inside. And it seemed like every bad guy in the city of Boston was there trying to get their hands on the kids for one reason or another. Yet you look at these kids and you see, on the left one, you see, and I knew most of these kids, And it hasn't really changed since those years. In fact, with the violence around drugs, it's gotten worse. But on the left, the kids, you can see sadness and resignation and fear. On the right, you can see, hey, there's still kids, regardless of what they're doing to keep body and soul together. They're kind of open, they're optimistic, they're kind of silly. And so it just was so clear to me that these thousands and thousands of kids that we had failed, that there was something going wrong and something that we had to try to make an impact on. And Sally Donaldson, you were there, you saw a chunk of this stuff. You can add your own thoughts later. Maybe it came across to you differently, but that's how I experienced it. So I kind of hope that answers the reason of why I wanted to get in also to working with child welfare work. I tried a few years of community organizing after this, and then I decided to go back and get a master's in public administration and see if I couldn't do something inside human services programs in government. But an old dear classmate of ours, John Gladney, was at Harvard Business School at that time teaching a real estate course. And he said, no, you've got great skills in terms of policy from your poli-sci degree. You should go get some practical skills. So he encouraged me to go to Harvard Business School. And then I spent, about 20 years inside government, almost all of it, except for that brief stint in St. Paul in human services, and learned a lot. I would think we were successful at getting a lot of things done in terms of redesigning systems and improving systems. But it also reminds me of the old question we had about whether you make change from the inside better or from the outside. And what I think after experiencing both is you need some of each. Often if you've worked in systems change in corporations or whatever, you know that it takes a jolt from the outside to get the organization out of its inertia. The classic case being the automobile industry in the 70s and 80s when the Japanese automakers came in and took huge chunks of market share overnight, or any kind of merger or consolidation of an industry jolts you out of your track. But then when you get there, you need people on the inside who can actually execute and make those changes. And I'm happy to say that of all the places I've worked in or consulted in, I've never been in a place where I didn't think the public sector employees were able to pull it off and willing to pull it off. And I was thinking about the last time with John talking about the EPA and how grateful we were all to them for just kind of holding things together under fire. And so there's a lot of skilled people out there. I think they need a lot more support and appreciation from us in the government sector. And so after I finished that, the last piece was I spent 15 years consulting, and mostly in child welfare, and I learned a lot about the IT systems and the data there. So then in 2009, I tried to put these pieces together into the safe passage, what I'm calling the logic model, by which I simply mean what are the components of the safe passage model and why do I think it will work. So the main things are citizen engagement, which I experienced both in community organizing and on the receiving end when I was in government, that people would come and try to get us to do things. The power of data in persuading people, and then the power of stories as well in persuading people. So I'm going to talk about each of these, I think, in turn, and just bring it all together, because all of these together try to drive policy and practice changes in government. But first, just let me share when I was starting and how I thought we were going to pay for it. First, I knew that we, even if they wanted to give us money, which they don't, that we weren't going to be able to accept any money from government because we had to be free to talk about what we needed to talk about. I'd hoped for some foundation money, but they turned out not to have any interest in us whatsoever, partly because just in our region of the country, there's not much support for advocacy of any kind. But as you will see as I go along here, we are in a spot where the activists on both ends of the spectrum do not like us very much, and foundations basically, in brief, don't want to get into the middle of that. So we are reliant on contributions from individuals, and big picture numbers. We've kept this very lean, and so we only need about $300,000 a year to keep, to kind of break even and reach financial stability. It's a small amount for a nonprofit, but a fair amount if you're trying to raise it all from individual contributions. I've gotten contributions and support from millions of people over the years, for which I'm really grateful, and other forms of help, like Peter and Greg did our first video, which professionalized our website a great deal and lifted us up. And so we've had a lot of support from classmates, but I think it would not be accurate to talk about how we got here without talking about the contribution of Dan and Liz Hahn here in the Twin Cities. They have not only themselves, been contributors, but they've brought along a lot of people, family and friends, and in particular, a lot of people in civic leadership positions that we really had no access to, that we were able to get in front of. And so they've raised the visibility of these issues in ways that, we wouldn't have been able to do alone, and significantly increase the size of the organization in the process. And so the scope of the changes that we've had a hand in really would not have been the same. I think I would still probably be filling out the envelopes and putting stamps on them without their involvement. So a lot of kids have benefited from that. And, again, there's so many good things that Williams people are doing in the civic sector that I'm really proud of, that I suppose there's no reason to be surprised. So first, let me go back to the first bubble on that chart, citizen engagement. This is a shot of our annual Day on the Hill in non-COVID years. What we do is try to bring all of our volunteers so we can get to the same place in the same time. And we set up appointments with their state representative and senator. We also do this at the county level. And we send them off. So this is a picture of our briefing session where we just go over the talking points and give people their schedules. And we do this several times a day during our Day on the Hill. And then when people go out and talk with their legislators, here's a picture of one of our former board chairs and her legislator, her state representative on the left. And these are the kinds of things the kind of data that our volunteers have educated our elected officials about, and are now common knowledge in the legislature. First of all, that Minnesota was responding to only 27% of maltreatment reports compared to 62% nationally. So that means fewer than half of the kids who would be seen by somebody in a typical state were just left hanging out there in Minnesota. So you remember that woman answering the phone, she would only be screening in 27% of those calls. Once they did get, and some of these kids were reported 10 or 15 or more times before anybody even screened them in. And then 70% went to this alternative response, this child protection light version. 62% of those were closed by the parents. We found that out from research we did with the University of Minnesota with our largest county. And then only 11% net of those cases that went down that track actually got service. And we're still tracking one child fatality on average per month. So the legislature now knows this stuff, which they did not know before our volunteers all got to them over the years. Here you may recognize a couple of our volunteers, a couple of robust looking older gentlemen on the sides. And then next to me is one of our more senior state senators and a couple of social workers. We find that our volunteers are largely people who have either personally had, been in the system as children, adult survivors, or they are social workers or school people, pediatricians, coaches, and guardians ad litem, who are people that, if you don't have them in your state, they're people who represent the child's interest in the custody cases when it goes to court to see whether or not children get removed permanently from their homes. So these are all people who have seen what's going on in the system and they're not happy with it, and they want to see what they can do about it. And one of the remarkable things, I've learned is that how nonpartisan people are when they're talking in these sessions about kids. We are, a non-ideology zone where people will go in and just talk about the kids. We have people from the Tea Party to the Green Party, but when they go in to talk to their legislators, they leave all that at the door. And I think one early story that will get that point across is that I set up a meeting with 5 women who were a mix of Democrats and Republicans politically to see the most conservative senator in the state Senate at that time. And we had a few talking points, and he would keep interrupting them and kind of poking at them with comments about why don't parents take care of their kids, or they shouldn't have as many kids if they don't want these kind of problems, et cetera. So the thing that was remarkable to me, and I had not coached them on this, is they did not rise to the bait. They took a beat, they let him stop, and then they went right back to their talking points. They were not about to be deterred. They were on a mission. and they were going to talk about kids regardless of. And so finally, one of the guardians said, you know, I had a kid in court with me last week, and he had cockroaches coming out of his shoes, and he doesn't deserve it. And the whole relationship with this guy changed at that moment. All our subsequent conversations with him were warm and friendly. He never agreed with us on anything, but he heard us out. He even helped us get a hearing once when we were really stuck. Never kind of, challenged us in hearings and so forth. So it shows you the subtle kind of impact you have. And we have relationships with people on both sides of the aisle because they don't perceive us as being in one camp or the other. So that's why we are a no ideology zone. So what I'd like to do at this point is then show you the other part. And if Ashley, if you can cue it up, show the other part of our thing, which is individual stories, which are sometimes the only thing that move some people. So Ashley, you ready to go? I'll stop sharing mine. You took it? Okay.
We lived in a white community, and it was honorable for a black man to be raising his daughter by himself. He was a batterer in his personal relationships. And then when there was no woman there, that came to me. It wasn't like an everyday thing, but when it happened, it was severe. Throughout the course of all of this, I began to run away at around 12. When I got a little older, I stayed in the streets. I started to learn what the streets were about and how to survive, like most runaways, and then it becomes a way of life. Mainly when they did step in, it was to penalize me. I actually got a ticket for being a habitual runaway, and then they sent me back to a dysfunctional home repeatedly. So they just caused the cycle to go over and over and over again. There was an incident where it escalated like 1,000 times, where it went to kicking and punching, and that's when I was thrown across the room and my hip began to dislocate after that incident. There was a major effort that had to take place for me to go into foster care, despite all of the evidence and the signs of abuse.
I survived 17 years of severe child abuse. Everybody loved my mom. On the outside, she always made sure that everybody thought we had the perfect life. She had driven me to a local park and taken me into a bathroom and put a gun to my head, and she had asked me to give her one reason why I should live. My best friend had told my counselor at school, and then because it was so drastic, the counselor then had to bring in the police. And at that point I was scared because I had previously turned in my mom multiple times. The first few times I was 100% honest about everything. Like, I could nail down every single bump, bruise, scratch, scar, everything. The system wasn't able to do anything to help me, and so I had to go back home, and every time I went back, it would be worse for telling, for sharing that, or in her words, I was humiliating her and making her look bad. At the time, I think that they were always trying to do what's best for the family, and for me in that case, what was best for the family wasn't what was best for me. And I stopped sharing, I stopped reaching out, I stopped telling people what's gonna happen when the system won't help me and then I have to go back. Like, am I actually gonna die this time? Like those are thoughts that would go through my head. So the system wasn't able to work for me, but that doesn't mean that we can't make it work for somebody else.
I would always want young people to know that they have rights, and I would like them to know that they deserve every bit of what everybody else has.
If I'm able to be part of an organization that's able to speak out and stop other people that that treat their children like that, that's something I want to be part of.
So I just really love that their effort is to make concrete changes within the law. That is amazing.
Rich, you're muted. There you go.
Yep, I'm sorry, I'm muting again. I'm unmuting. So I was just saying that I always feel like I could talk about that video for an hour because it's so chronic that we actually just don't listen to kids. You don't realize it until you're in the field, and just treat them like property. And they do have rights, legal rights, but they're honored more in the briefs and the observance. So I want to move on to how we move forward this. We have to work with counties and the state. It's a little bit like, I think, being a diplomat to a foreign country that we have real issues with, but you still have to keep the lines of communication open with. And then our relationships with the activist group are pretty critical to us moving this agenda forward. So this I'm going to illustrate with a photo of my granddaughter, Iris, who's 3 years old. Sometimes when we're working with the counties in the state, we're cooking up great stuff together. It's all smiles. We're even color coordinated. Can you all see that all right? This slide of with the photo of my granddaughter. Yeah, you can see it. Okay, that's the way it is. But I have to be honest, that more often than not, it's more like this. This is our relationship with the state and the counties. I think this is the day when I was on child care duty. I'm not sure, but that's really kind of the gist of it most of the time. But I try to keep in mind that really it's the system. It's not the workers. If you've ever worked in a system, change stuff in companies, whatever, you know, the research that most of the mistakes and the bad outcomes in any kind of system, whether it's manufacturing or business or whatever, are due to the way the system is set up. So I've worked with brilliant caseworkers who probably ought to be enshrined somewhere, huge number of really competent, well-trained, diligent caseworkers, and a handful of people who ought to be counseled out of the field, right? But what we find is that they are trying to do the right thing, but they're being guided into practices that are actually sometimes harmful for kids. And some of the really good ones figure out how to navigate that, but it's exhausting. They're always swimming against the tide. And most people eventually just kind of, give up and kind of drink the Kool-Aid. And so as a result, there's a lot of people who are well-intentioned, carrying out poor practices. So then you add to that the fact that we need to keep on good terms with the activist group. We don't really engage with the activists on the right because they only kind of show up to, they don't do a lot of stuff, but when we have a bill, they can come in and just kind of knock us out of the water with the bill and get a senator to not hear it. But with the activists, we're all in the same pool, swimming together. And their view of it, especially in the African American, Native American communities, is that the purpose of child protection is like it was with removing children from Indian communities to go to boarding schools. It just kind of comes in, doesn't understand the culture, removes children unnecessarily, and creates a havoc. So in their view, many of them just think the system ought to be abolished. It's very much like the debate about, there's no point in trying to fix it. You're trying to fix a system that's just going to do a better job at a bad thing. So it's, as I say, kind of like the debate around the police. But we think that somebody has to be still taking care of the children and making sure they're okay. So always looking for opportunities to try to build bridges there. And so this last year is an example of how we tried to tackle that. There was a senator, an African-American leader, came to us and said he needed some help. He wasn't a big fan of ours, but a group of progressive activists and kind of legal think tanks wanted to get a bill through that would reduce the legal barriers to becoming a foster parent, particularly a kin foster parent, like a grandmother or an auntie. But many people in their communities had a felony somewhere in their past. And some of it was long ago and didn't really have much to do with their ability to be a good kinship parent today. But they were all kind of listed together. But what this group did was basically took everything off the list of disqualifiers. So there were things having to do with sexually perving on children, domestic violence, armed robbery, things that are violent crimes. And we were okay with a lot of that, the nonviolent felonies, but wanted to kind of curate the list of more violent felonies. So we have a couple of people who are involved with this who are recently retired judges. We spent about a year getting that bill to the point where we thought it would get through the legislature. A fact is that in Minnesota we have a split legislature. We're the only place in the country. So we've got a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. And it could get through the House maybe, but it was a non-starter in the Senate. So the fact that we have relationships across the aisles put us in a position to help. And it was a perfect bill because everybody hated it. There were people calling each other racist all over the place and writing nasty letters. And in the end, everybody swallowed hard and said, this is the best we're going to get. Let's go with it. So the first stop was a committee that is generally known as the committee where bills go to die. So, and not even controversial bills. It's really hard to get on this guy's agenda. But we brought in, once we got the bill clean, we brought in, our real kind of heavy hitters, particularly a retired Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court, who is, really well respected in the Republican community. And she worked her magic. And we got it through this session. All three committees it had to go through the Senate, got through the House. And at this moment, it is sitting in the omnibus Health and Human Services bills in both chambers, which is, almost tantamount to passing the bill, probably a 95% chance of passing it in a special session next month. So that's kind of political collateral that we hope to use going forward to say, hey, we can do more good stuff like this, say good things about us to your stakeholders, et cetera. So that's kind of politically how we try to navigate all this landscape. So then I want to, kind of the last leg of this journey is to talk about how we have fared in terms of making some changes. And we had a big turning point in 2014. The Star Tribune, which is a regional newspaper here, it's a really good newspaper, did an investigative reporting series on 63 children who were murdered despite being known to child protection. And they featured a little 4-year-old boy pictured here named Eric Dean, who was killed by his stepmother despite 15 reports of child protection that went almost all unanswered from frantic child care workers and teachers and people in the community. And this appeared on Labor Day weekend on Sunday above the fold, this big photo, they really did it up. And the Governor Dayton at that time saw it and he was moved by it and set up a task force on child protection. And so Governor Dayton, as it happens, was one of the counselors at that runaway house in Boston with me so many years ago. So he knew about our work. We're not golfing buddies or anything, but he knew what we were doing and appreciated it. So 4 or 5 of us, there were a lot of people on this task force, but 4 or 5 of us really tried to drive some recommendations and changes. And the long and short of it is those recommendations from the task force that we actually got into legislation subsequently were followed and have made a significant impact on the quality of the system. And the ones that were recommendations without law behind them were pretty much ignored by the state and the counties. In fact, quite consciously ignored by them. So I'll let you know what some of those are. But the big one, if I can just pick one that was followed because it got put into legislation, was that the state had to set standards for that first maltreatment report, that first call that comes in. And the counties had to follow them, which sounds normal, except that the state has only set guidelines for all of these steps in the process in the past, and the counties have just interpreted those guidelines in a very wide variety of ways. Practices are very dissimilar across the state. And so it was kind of a breakthrough to say that, no, you have to set standards in this area and counties have to actually do it. So I have tried to stay away from charts, but if you just look at the orange bar on the left, that's just before the task force. And I can't read the number because it's small on my screen, But the number of reports that got screened in went up substantially from 20-some thousand. I think it's 36 or 37 from memory. And that amounted to about 22,000 more children annually getting some kind of a child protection response, whether the alternative response or the regular traditional response.
Hey, Rich, I'm sorry to interrupt, but it looks like we're actually seeing your screen right now in your note setting. So it looks really small for us too.
Oh,
So
for
I
you
don't
as
know
well?
if you
Let
can,
me get out of that and see if I can do that without.
it had worked earlier, but right now, yeah.
Well, the numbers throw things off a lot. So I'm just going to stop sharing and fix that and come back, if that's all right. This may take me a minute. There we go. Now, I don't know if I'm still sharing the screen. I don't believe I am. But,
You're not. Go ahead and try sharing now.
okay.
Yes, now we can see it big. Thank you.
All right. So you can see we went in 2014 over in the orange here from 20,700 and some to 37,000 and some reports that were screened in. So from 27% to 43%, and that meant 22,000 or so more children annually getting a public child protection response. So that had ripple effects. The increased number of cases, instead of making the budget tighter, actually drew down a lot of new federal dollars. And that had to be matched by the state, which was important because the state had very little skin in the game. And in the past, most of the money had to be put up by the county. So that brought in some new state money as well. And additional revenues of about increase of 47 or so %. They were able to add 400 caseworkers statewide and brought caseloads down significantly. Interestingly, speaking of the inside versus outside change, this was based on a change that way back, 30 some years ago when I was an assistant commissioner in Maryland. I worked with my counterparts in several other states, and we persuaded the federal government to make this change, to have Medicaid dollars support 50% of the cost of case management services in child protection. So all these years later, of course, it's been benefiting states ever since, but all these years later, it's still there, and it made a big difference in our ability to get some of these changes done. But as I said, the changes not put into law were largely ignored. So more transparency, we asked for a lot more reports. None of them have materialized. These are really basic reports that we know the state can do. The number of cases going to this alternative response was initially supposed to be about 25%, and it was well over 70%. But and we wanted to get it back down to that 25, but still over 60% of cases are going to alternative response. And since you can only put about a third of cases into this low risk category, that means a whole lot of high risk situations are being put in this kind of child protection light category. Nothing's really been done on quality improvements. No other areas have standards and consistent practices. So that leads to the reforms that we're seeking through legislation. We want legislation now to say that states and the counties basically have to stop interviewing children in front of the adults at that initial child protection visit, stop giving advance notice of that visit, do fact finding in all cases, and then keep a record of what was found. I haven't mentioned that once people go through this alternative response, nothing is put in the record. So if the case comes back in 6 months or a year later, that next worker has no idea of what was discovered. So that leads to the future for safe passage. Of course, we're interested in long-term viability. We want to get to that 300,000 mark, because that's when I can hire my replacement. That's the succession plan. Hopefully the person will let me continue to be involved, but somebody really needs to kind of grab on and take this forward. With Safe Passage, I always get that feeling you get when you know a timer is about to go off. You know, it's like, you know, am I gonna get this done in time? You know, you all know how old I am, as Van likes to say. We do have some program expansion that we're looking at, even though we have limited bandwidth, one of which is to start support groups for survivors of child maltreatment. They are our most credible and our most you know, reliable volunteers, and have been wanting to do this for a while. So we're looking at something that's based on the same model as is used for survivors of sexual assault by priests, because it's kind of self-managed, not a lot of liability risk, and fairly easy to administer. And we are looking at possibly adding a litigation kind of prong to our efforts as a way to kind of move change along and hopefully bring the state and counties to the table. So we're working with a local law school here about possibly having an intern or clerk to work with us for a year on a feasibility study that would figure out whether there are ways we can do a class action type lawsuit or other litigation to move the agenda forward. So that's, you know, some of the things we have planned for the future. So that's it. I'm gonna say, you know, thank you, and I look forward to hearing what you have, the things you have to say about this, and let me turn it back over then to Ken.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent, good. Well, thank you, Rich. That was really wonderfully done, very moving. I love your logo, by the way. The little kid with the umbrella, that's fabulous too. All right, well, we're gonna now go into breakout rooms. There'll be, I don't know, 5 or 6 breakout rooms. And the idea there is just to chat amongst ourselves about what Rich has brought to our attention. There are, we put together several potential questions that you might want to address or not, but you might want to take a look at those. And one would be, if you have any experiences yourself with changing career direction and to address a social ill the way Rich has. I think it's pretty unique, but there may be other stories out there like that. The second question would be whether anyone's got any similar experience trying to lobby the governments, state, county, or municipal for the common good, as Rich has done. And finally, just are you aware, or were you ever aware of the kinds of the situations that Rich has revealed here about child abuse and so on? And if so, what has your experience been with that? So with that, with those questions in mind, and really just an opportunity to get together and talk about this, we'll come back at about 8 o'clock. And then, so hold your questions for Rich, and we'll go through those at that point. You'll use the hands up feature, and we'll try to get to as many as we can between 8 and 8:15. So with that, let's go to the breakout rooms.
Uh-oh, what happened? Did you not get put in a room?
I don't want to be in a room.
Okay.
I work in the child welfare system and have a totally different perspective. There's a higher rate of abuse in foster care than there is in the general population. And I think he's encouraging.
More and more acting out. And I remember feeling I was seriously over my head.
I think especially in the early days, I think it changed a lot once we got the bad guys out.
Yeah. Well, I didn't know how to think systemically at the time. I went on to become a therapist, so it was.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. And I see Larry Ricketts has a question. Larry.
Rich, first of all, just fantastic work. We're proud of you. The story was remarkable. But I'm just curious, for those of us that have worked in the nonprofit world through either volunteer or others, it would be interesting to tell the group, how much time do you spend of your time trying to raise money and getting funding from individuals? What percentage?
Well, probably no doubt not as much as I should. I do spend a lot of time, just doing keeping the lights on kind of thing. But I'm guessing 25% of my time, just off the top of my head. But obviously, it hasn't been enough. So, I have to maybe allocate a little more time to that. Yeah.
Rich, just on that axis, do you get paid?
No, I don't. Sort of like any startup, you try not to take a paycheck until you break even, right? Well, we're going to break even. Break even for me is going to be when I can hire somebody to take over.
So I guess that was, again, related to my concerns about sustainability, because there aren't a lot of people out there who would do what you're doing for nothing.
No, there's not going to be any sustainability unless we can pay somebody to do this. People have to make a living. But it's not a huge amount of money more than what we're doing now. So I have some hope there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Larry. Jonathan Vipond would like to weigh in.
Thanks, Rich. It's been incredibly impressive, and I'm very proud of you. I have had some experience in this arena, having served as the chief counsel for our Department of Public Welfare in Pennsylvania, and serving in the Pennsylvania state legislature long ago. There has been improvements. Pennsylvania isn't much better. It probably isn't as good as you are in Minnesota, but there's still, foster care is something I want to refer to, because it is not an absolute panacea. Certainly in Pennsylvania, we've had lots of problems with a minority, fortunately, of foster parents who were in this for reasons not of compassion, probably for money. Kinship is better, but the goal of most legislation is to reunite children with their families. And I think you've made a very good case. When there is no family, reunification is not, it's worse than almost any other alternative. Do I read you correctly or hear you correctly in that regard?
Yeah, you take a look at those runaways and street kids. They left situations that were intolerable.
Right.
But we keep, from that little video, we keep trying to send kids home to situations where they're likely to get hurt or killed or just destroyed. But on the foster care front, one of the things in Minnesota, we're probably not as good as you think we are, because there really isn't any kind of a quality standard here. And I've noticed since 2017 that 25% of the child fatalities are in foster care. It wasn't true before. And so that bill that I mentioned, we did get inserted in that bill, a process to evaluate prospective foster parents is based on some qualitative assessment of their ability to. That's where I think we need to go. We need to have a much tighter kind of assessment process for foster parents. And, kind of counterintuitively, I think that'll bring a lot more people of color into the system, because it's going to be objective based on whether they are able to do good parenting. So, but right now it's just pretty random who gets to be a foster parent, and some of them kill kids. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Rich, I have a question. This is Ken. How hard was it to take the decision to make this change and start from scratch a nonprofit organization like this? Change of direction.
It was just something I, ever since working with kids, that I just kind of felt I had to do. I think somebody that was on a panel, and they say these careers, you don't choose these careers, you choose you. And that's kind of says it in a nutshell. You kind of just have to do it. So I started this when I was still doing consulting. So you picture me with, 2 computer screens, 2 sets of passwords, 2 entirely different sets of lingos.
Are you breaking them?
Yeah, when I started the first several years, 4 years. And then I finally had to give it up and retire a little earlier than I planned to. But
Hold them.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. You chopped up.
Okay,
So, I don't know, someone's,
I think it was just somebody unmuted that didn't mean to be unmuted. So
Oh,
I
but
muted.
that-
okay. So any other questions? I think we're
Roy
running.
Bennett put a question in
Hey,
the
Roy.
chat and has his
Oh,
hand
okay.
up.
I don't see any chats. I'm wondering if Roy, good to see you. I haven't seen you in so
Yeah,
long.
good to see you and to hear about your work. My question is,
Where'd he go?
is it, I don't know, I disappeared.
No, you're there.
Oh, okay. In any case, I'm wondering whether there is any formal role for the legal profession in the child welfare system in Minnesota. I spent the last 16 years representing kids to secure their educational rights, but we were in a collaboration with social workers, educational experts, and me, the legal arm. But all the kids in Santa Clara County where I live and where I work have an attorney who represents them in the child welfare proceedings. So what I did was added on to that. It was a service that was funded through the county, but it was federal funds that paid for it. So is there any role for attorneys in the system where you work?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I was talking about, we're looking at whether, what we can do legally that we haven't tried to do before. And, but right now, every child 10 and over, because of some changes that somebody else worked on, but we supported, has right to an attorney to represent their point of view in a case. So you have these situations where kids are saying, I don't want to go home. They're 10, 12 years old, and nobody's there to kind of stand up for them. So now those kids 10 and over do have the right to an attorney and to be told about that right.
Who provides the attorney? I mean, where does the attorney come from? And who
The
pays
county, the county has to pay for it.
Okay, so the
That's
kid,
one.
but the child has to ask for an attorney?
Well, they do, but they now have to be proactively told about the right to an attorney. Before they had a right legally, but nobody knew about it. So
yeah,
got that change made.
Okay, this I think is the end of our formal time. We are going to go a little bit longer informally before the college evaporates us at 8:30. But at this point, I do want to thank publicly Rich for all of us, for assuming that most of the people are still on the Zoom at this point. That was a wonderful presentation, and it was eye-opening to me, stimulating, and boy, you've got a lot of work out there. So, but well done. Congratulations on your embarking on this and making such a big difference here. You've really got momentum. A lot of work ahead, but well done, sir.
Thanks, Ken.
Before we go on, let me also remind people that we have another session like this coming up on June 17th, same time, same channel. It's going to be an evening with the E-flats, as our old members of the E-flats reflect on their times and maybe explain how they pulled off those fantastic renderings that they did of their old numbers a couple of months ago. So with that, anybody who wants to bail can bail, but anybody who wants to remain for another few minutes may do so. And I'm sure Rich would entertain any further questions or just discussion.
We can just